What started as simple sleepwalking episodes during my college years has become the most terrifying curse I could ever imagine. For the past 8 months, I've been sleepwalking to locations around Denver, Colorado, where violent crimes are about to happen. Sometimes hours, sometimes days before they actually occur. I don't just arrive at these places, I witness the murders, the attacks, the horrific details of crimes that haven't happened yet, but always, inevitably do. I've tried everything to stop this nightmare. Sleep clinics, medication, restraints, even moving to different cities. Nothing works. Every few nights I fall asleep in my own bed and wake up standing in some dark alley, abandoned warehouse, or quiet suburban home where I watch, helpless and invisible, as future victims meet their fate. The worst part isn't seeing these horrible events. It's knowing that no matter what I do, no matter how hard I try to warn people or prevent these crimes, they always happen exactly as I've seen them. This is my real account of living with supernatural sleepwalking that forces me to witness tomorrow's violence. The police think I'm either crazy or involved. My family doesn't believe me. And the murders keep happening, exactly as I've seen them in my sleepwalking visions, with details only the killer and the victim should know. Don't forget to like this video if it gave you chills, subscribe for more terrifying true paranormal experiences, and hit that notification bell so you never miss content that will keep you up at night. Share your own precognitive experiences in the comments below. You might not be alone in this nightmare. Precognitive sleepwalking and supernatural visions of future crimes represent one of the most disturbing forms of paranormal experience imaginable. When sleep becomes a gateway to witnessing violence that hasn't yet occurred, when dreams transform into prophetic nightmares that always come true, we enter a realm of horror that challenges our understanding of time, consciousness, and free will. This true story explores the psychological and supernatural terror of being forced to see the future but being powerless to change it. The phenomenon of precognitive dreams and sleepwalking to future crime scenes has been documented in various forms throughout history, but rarely with such detailed and consistent accuracy. This account reveals the devastating psychological impact of supernatural foresight, the horror of trying to prevent inevitable tragedies, and the terrifying realization that some people are cursed to serve as unwilling witnesses to tomorrow's violence. Your sleepwalking horror, precognitive dreams, supernatural visions, future crimes, paranormal sleeping, prophetic nightmares, supernatural true story, time travel horror, psychic visions, paranormal experience, creepy true story, supernatural encounter, horror story, true horror, paranormal activity, dream horror, precognition, nightmare, supernatural curse, future visions, horror experience. 4. Tags: sleepwalking horror, precognitive dreams, supernatural visions, future crimes, paranormal sleeping, prophetic nightmares, supernatural true story, time travel horror, psychic visions, paranormal experience, creepy true story, supernatural encounter, horror story, true horror, paranormal activity, dream horror, precognition nightmare, supernatural curse, future visions, horror experience, sleepwalking to crime scenes, precognitive sleepwalking, future murder visions, prophetic crime, dreams, supernatural witness, paranormal Denver, time horror, dream crime scenes, supernatural foresight, horror predictions. Complete video script, 10,000 words. Paragraph 1. When sleep became a gateway to tomorrow's horror. 2,000 words. I need to tell you something that will sound absolutely insane, but I swear on everything I hold dear that every word of this story is true. My name is Alex. I'm 24 years old, and for the past 8 months, I've been living with a supernatural curse that has destroyed my life, my relationships, and my faith in everything I thought I understood about reality. I sleepwalk to crime scenes before they happen. Not after, before. Sometimes hours before, sometimes days before, but always, inevitably, before the violence actually occurs. I stand there, invisible and helpless, watching murders unfold in vivid, horrifying detail, knowing that no matter what I do when I wake up, these exact scenes will play out in the real world exactly as I've witnessed them in my sleepwalking visions. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had dreams that came true, because what started as simple sleepwalking during my junior year at the University of Colorado, Denver, has become the most terrifying experience any human being should have to endure. I'd been a normal college student, studying computer science, living in a shared apartment near campus, dealing with the usual stresses of exams and part-time jobs, and wondering what I was going to do with my life after graduation. The sleepwalking started innocuously enough. My roommate Jake would find me standing in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, staring at the refrigerator, or sitting on the couch in the living room with my eyes wide open but completely unresponsive to his attempts to wake me up. At first, we laughed about it. College stress, too much caffeine, irregular sleep schedules. It seemed like a perfectly normal response to the pressures of academic life. Jake would gently guide me back to my bedroom, and I'd wake up the next morning with no memory of the incident, just a lingering sense of unease and the strange feeling that I had been somewhere important during the night. The episodes happened maybe once or twice a week, always in familiar spaces, always ending with me back in my own bed with no memory of how I got there. But 3 months into the semester, something changed. Instead of just wandering around our apartment, I started leaving the building entirely. Jake woke up one morning to find our front door standing wide open and me nowhere to be found. He called my phone frantically, worried that something terrible had happened, until I answered from a location I couldn't explain. A parking garage downtown that I had never visited before, standing in my pajamas and bare feet with no memory of how I had gotten there or why I was there. Hit the like button if this supernatural sleepwalking is already making you nervous, because what happened next was when I first realized that something genuinely supernatural was happening to me. That morning, when Jake picked me up from the parking garage, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed something important during the night, something violent and terrible that I needed to remember. The details were frustratingly vague, like trying to recall a dream that slips away the moment you open your eyes, but I could smell blood and hear screaming and feel the overwhelming presence of evil and violence. Later that day, the local news reported that a woman named Sarah Martinez had been attacked in that exact parking garage in the exact spot where Jake had found me standing. She had been walking to her car after working a late shift at a nearby restaurant when someone grabbed her from behind, beat her severely, and stole her purse and car keys. The attack had happened around 2:30 in the morning, exactly when I would have been sleepwalking through downtown Denver in my pajamas, somehow drawn to the scene of violence like a supernatural magnet. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. Denver is a big city with plenty of crime, and parking garages are unfortunately common locations for attacks. There was no logical reason to connect my sleepwalking episode to Sarah's assault, no rational explanation for how I could have been drawn to that specific location at that specific time. But deep down, in some part of my consciousness that recognized truth even when it defied all logic and reason, I knew that what had happened was impossible and real and terrifying. Subscribe if you want to hear more about supernatural experiences that challenge everything we think we know about reality, because the sleepwalking episodes continued, and they followed a pattern that became increasingly impossible to deny or explain away. Every few nights, I would go to sleep in my own bed and wake up somewhere else in the city, always in locations where violent crimes had recently occurred or were about to occur. Sometimes I would wake up in the exact spot where someone had been mugged the night before. Sometimes I would find myself standing outside a house where a domestic violence incident was reported to police later that same day. Jake started locking our apartment door and hiding the keys, thinking that would keep me safely inside during my sleepwalking episodes. But I would somehow find ways to get out anyway. Through windows I shouldn't have been able to open, through doors that should have been securely locked, through routes that made no physical sense given the layout of our building. And every time, I would wake up at the scene of violence, either past or future, with fragments of memory that suggested I had somehow witnessed the crimes in vivid, horrifying detail. The turning point came 6 months ago, when I woke up standing in an alley behind a 24-hour diner on the east side of Denver, wearing nothing but my boxer shorts and a t-shirt, shivering in the February cold. I had no memory of leaving my apartment, no idea how I had traveled the 15 miles from my neighborhood to this unfamiliar part of the city. But as I stood there trying to figure out where I was and how to get home, I was overwhelmed by the most vivid and terrifying vision I had ever experienced. Comment below what you think these visions really are, because what I saw in that alley was not a memory or a dream, but something that felt more real than my own waking consciousness. I watched a man in his 50s, wearing a cook's apron and carrying a bag of garbage from the diner, walk into the alley where I was standing. I saw another figure emerge from behind a dumpster, a young man with hollow eyes and desperate movements, clearly high on something that had stripped away his humanity and left only predatory need. I watched the robbery unfold with the crystalline clarity of someone standing 3 feet away from the action. I saw the junkie demand money, saw the cook try to cooperate, saw the situation escalate when the cook explained that he didn't have access to the restaurant's cash register. I watched the junkie pull out a knife, watched the cook try to run, watched the blade sink into the older man's back as he stumbled toward the street calling for help. I saw blood spreading across the cook's white apron, saw him collapse to the dirty asphalt, saw the junkie rifle through his pockets before disappearing into the maze of alleys that crisscrossed that part of the city. But here's the thing that made this vision different from the vague memories of my previous sleepwalking episodes. I knew, with absolute certainty, that what I was seeing hadn't happened yet. The cook wasn't lying in the alley bleeding when I woke up there. The dumpster area was clean, with no signs of violence or disturbance. The whole scene had the quality of something that was going to happen, something that I was being shown in advance, something that I was supposed to witness or prevent or understand. Share your thoughts on precognitive visions in the comments below, because what happened next confirmed my worst fears and changed my entire understanding of what was happening to me. I spent the rest of that morning trying to convince myself that what I had seen was just a vivid nightmare brought on by the stress and confusion of waking up in an unfamiliar place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the vision was real and important and inevitable. So I did something that I knew would sound crazy to anyone I tried to explain it to. I called the police. I told them that I had reason to believe someone was going to be attacked behind the diner on Colfax Avenue, that they should increase patrols in that area, that a cook or restaurant employee might be in danger. The dispatcher was polite but clearly skeptical, asking me how I had come by this information and whether I had witnessed any actual criminal activity. When I couldn't provide satisfactory answers to either question, she assured me that they would look into it in the tone of voice that people use when they're humoring someone they think might be mentally unstable. That night, I barely slept, checking the local news websites obsessively for any reports of violence in the area where I had experienced my vision. By morning, there was nothing. By afternoon, I was starting to feel foolish and relieved, thinking that maybe I really had just had a particularly vivid nightmare brought on by waking up in a strange place. But at 6:15 that evening, the story appeared on the Denver Post's website. A 53-year-old restaurant cook named Miguel Santos had been stabbed and robbed in the alley behind Tony's all-night diner on East Colfax Avenue. The details matched my vision perfectly. Miguel had been taking out the garbage after the dinner rush when he was approached by a young man who demanded money. When Miguel explained that he was just a cook and didn't have access to the restaurant's cash, the attacker stabbed him once in the back and fled with Miguel's wallet and cell phone. Miguel survived, but he spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from his injuries, and according to the news report, he was considering quitting his job because he no longer felt safe working night shifts. Let me know in the comments if you've ever known something was going to happen before it actually did, because that night, as I read the news article that described exactly what I had seen during my sleepwalking episode, I realized that my life had changed in ways I couldn't understand or control. I wasn't just sleepwalking to random locations around the city. I was being shown the future, forced to witness violence and suffering that hadn't happened yet, but inevitably would. And worse than that, my attempts to prevent these crimes by calling the police or trying to warn potential victims had been completely useless. The supernatural sleepwalking episodes continued with increasing frequency and intensity. Every few nights, I would fall asleep in my apartment and wake up somewhere else in Denver, always at the scene of future violence. Always with perfect, horrifying clarity about what was going to happen and when. I saw muggings and assaults, break-ins and domestic violence incidents, drug deals gone wrong, and gang conflicts that would leave young men bleeding in the streets. And no matter what I did with the information, calling police, trying to warn victims, even attempting to be present at the locations to intervene, the crimes always happened exactly as I had foreseen them.
Paragraph 2. The visions become more violent. 2,000 words. As the months passed, my sleepwalking visions began to escalate in both frequency and horror. What had started as witnessing relatively minor crimes, muggings, car thefts, simple assaults, evolved into something far more sinister and disturbing. I began to see murders.
Not just heat-of-the-moment violence that resulted in accidental death, but premeditated, calculated killings carried out by people who took pleasure in the suffering of their victims. The supernatural force that was dragging me from my bed to witness these future crimes seemed to be drawn to the most violent and depraved acts that Denver's underbelly had to offer. Let me know in the comments if you think some people are psychically drawn to violence, because what I experienced 3 months ago was the most terrifying vision of my entire ordeal. I woke up standing in the living room of a house I had never seen before, in a neighborhood I didn't recognize, watching a scene of domestic horror that will be seared into my memory for the rest of my life. A woman in her 30s wearing a bathrobe and holding a cup of coffee was going through her morning routine, completely unaware that someone was watching her from the shadows near her back door. The intruder was a man in his 40s with the kind of cold, predatory eyes that suggested this wasn't his first time breaking into someone's home with violent intentions. He had been studying this woman's routines for weeks, learning her schedule, figuring out when she was most vulnerable. As I stood there, invisible and helpless, I watched him produce a set of zip ties and a roll of duct tape from his jacket pocket. This wasn't a robbery or a random break-in. This was something much worse, something planned and methodical and evil. I tried to scream, tried to move, tried to do anything that might warn the woman or disrupt what was about to happen, but in my sleepwalking visions, I exist as nothing more than a passive observer, unable to interact with the physical world or influence the events I'm being forced to witness. I could only stand there and watch as the intruder waited for the perfect moment to strike, as the woman finished her coffee and headed toward the shower, completely unaware that her normal Wednesday morning routine was about to be shattered by unthinkable violence. Hit the like button if this escalating supernatural horror is making your blood run cold, because what I saw next was beyond anything I had witnessed in my previous visions. The man followed the woman into her bathroom, and what happened there was so violent and prolonged that I won't describe it in detail. Not because I'm trying to spare your sensibilities, but because speaking those images aloud feels like giving them more power, more reality, more presence in the world than they already have. What I will tell you is that the woman's name was Linda Kowalski. She was a nurse at Denver Health Medical Center, and she had recently ended a relationship with a man who had been stalking and harassing her for months. The police had been involved, restraining orders had been filed, but the legal system had failed to protect her from someone determined to hurt her. And now, in my supernatural vision, I was watching the inevitable conclusion of his obsession play out in graphic, horrifying detail. When I woke up from that vision, I was standing in Linda's backyard, wearing only my underwear and a t-shirt, shivering in the pre-dawn cold of early March. I could see lights on in the house, could hear the faint sound of a shower running, could see Linda moving around in her kitchen exactly as I had witnessed in my vision. But unlike my previous sleepwalking episodes, this time I knew exactly when the violence was going to occur and exactly how to prevent it. I ran to the nearest house and pounded on the door until a confused and frightened neighbor answered, begging them to call 911 and report that someone was about to break into Linda Kowalski's house. I gave them the address, described the intruder in detail, and explained that a woman's life was in immediate danger. The neighbor was clearly terrified by my appearance, a nearly naked young man, incoherent with panic and desperation. But they called the police while I continued pounding on other doors, trying to wake up anyone who might be willing to help. Subscribe if you want to hear more about desperate attempts to prevent supernatural visions from coming true, because what happened next taught me the most devastating lesson about my curse. The police arrived within minutes, responding to multiple calls about a disturbance in the neighborhood. They found me ranting about an impending murder, describing in precise detail what Linda's attacker looked like and exactly how he was planning to get into her house. But when they went to check on Linda, they found her alive and well, getting ready for work, with no signs of any intruder or threat. The police questioned me extensively, wanting to know how I knew so much about Linda's house and routine, why I was in her neighborhood in my underwear, and what had led me to believe she was in danger. I tried to explain about the sleepwalking and the visions, but the story sounded insane even to me, and it was clear that the officers suspected me of being either mentally unstable or somehow involved in planning the very crime I was trying to prevent. They took me to the hospital for a psychiatric evaluation and kept me under observation for 48 hours. 2 days later, while I was still being held for mental health evaluation, Linda Kowalski was murdered in her home by her ex-boyfriend. The crime happened exactly as I had seen it in my vision. He broke in through her back door while she was getting ready for work. He used zip ties and duct tape to restrain her. And what he did to her before killing her was so brutal that the detective assigned to the case told reporters it was one of the most savage crimes he had investigated in 20 years of police work. Comment below whether you think the police should have taken my warning more seriously, because the aftermath of Linda's murder was when I realized that my supernatural ability wasn't just a curse, it was a trap. The police, who had previously dismissed me as a disturbed individual making random threats, suddenly became very interested in how I had known so many specific details about Linda's death. They wanted to know why I had been in her neighborhood at the exact time her killer was planning his attack, how I had known about the zip ties and duct tape, why my description of the crime scene was so accurate, I became the primary suspect in Linda's murder. The fact that I had tried to warn people about the attack, that I had begged the police to check on her safety, that I had been genuinely desperate to prevent the crime, none of that mattered when they were looking for someone to blame for her death. My sleepwalking episodes, my history of appearing at crime scenes, my detailed knowledge of violent events that hadn't happened yet, it all looked like evidence of guilt rather than supernatural ability. I spent 2 weeks in jail before Linda's actual killer was arrested. Her ex-boyfriend, Marcus Webb, was caught when he tried to use her credit cards at a gas station across town. He confessed to the murder during interrogation, providing details that matched my vision perfectly and clearing me of any involvement in the crime. But the experience of being suspected, arrested, and jailed for a murder I had desperately tried to prevent taught me that my supernatural curse wasn't just about witnessing future violence. It was about being trapped in a system where the very ability that allowed me to see these crimes made me appear guilty of committing them. After my release, I tried everything I could think of to stop the sleepwalking episodes. I saw sleep specialists who prescribed powerful medications designed to suppress the REM cycles that might be triggering my supernatural visions. I tried sleeping pills that were supposed to keep me unconscious and immobile throughout the night. I even experimented with physical restraints, handcuffing myself to my bed and giving Jake the keys, thinking that I could prevent myself from leaving the apartment even if the supernatural force tried to compel me to sleepwalk. Nothing worked. No matter what drugs I took, no matter how secure I thought I had made my sleeping arrangements, I continued to wake up at crime scenes throughout Denver, witnessing murders and assaults that would happen exactly as I had seen them. The medications made me groggy and disoriented during the day, but they had no effect on my supernatural sleepwalking. The restraints were somehow bypassed. I would wake up in alleys and abandoned buildings with the handcuffs still locked around my wrists, as if I had been transported there by some force that existed outside the normal laws of physics. Share your own experiences with supernatural compulsions in the comments below, because the worst part of my curse wasn't the visions themselves. It was the growing realization that I was completely powerless to prevent the violence I was being shown. Every attempt I made to warn potential victims or alert the authorities only made me look more suspicious and potentially dangerous. The police had my name and address on file as someone who appeared at crime scenes and claimed to have advanced knowledge of violent crimes. Social workers and psychiatrists had diagnosed me with various forms of mental illness, despite my insistence that my visions were accurate and supernatural rather than delusional. But the most devastating revelation came 4 months ago, when I realized that my attempts to prevent the crimes I witnessed in my visions weren't just failing, they were actually ensuring that the crimes happened exactly as I had seen them. When I tried to warn Linda Kowalski, my panicked behavior in her neighborhood had caused enough commotion to delay her morning routine by exactly the amount of time needed for her killer to get into position. When I called police about potential muggings or assaults, the increased patrol presence in those areas often drove the criminals to commit their crimes at slightly different times or locations, but never prevented the violence entirely. It was as if my knowledge of future crimes was part of the mechanism that made those crimes inevitable. The supernatural force that was showing me these visions wasn't trying to help me prevent violence. It was using me as an unwilling participant in ensuring that the future unfolded exactly as it was supposed to. I wasn't a potential hero who could save lives with advanced knowledge. I was a cog in some cosmic machine that required these specific acts of violence to occur at these specific times and places. Let me know in the comments if you believe some events are destined to happen no matter what we do to prevent them, because this realization marked the beginning of the darkest period of my supernatural ordeal. If I couldn't prevent the crimes I witnessed, if my very attempts to help people only made their situations worse, then what was the point of these visions? Why was I being forced to see these horrible events if there was nothing I could do to stop them? Was I being punished for some cosmic crime I didn't remember committing? Was I being tested by forces beyond human understanding? Or was I simply unlucky enough to have become a supernatural witness to the violence that flows beneath the surface of every major city? The questions haunted me during my waking hours, but they couldn't compare to the horror of the visions themselves, which continued to escalate in frequency and brutality as if responding to my growing despair and helplessness. And the worst was yet to come. Paragraph 3. The Supernatural Truth. 2,000 words. The night everything changed was a Tuesday in late June, when I experienced a sleepwalking vision unlike any of the previous ones. Instead of being transported to a specific location where I would witness a future crime, I found myself standing in what appeared to be a vast, impossibly dark space that stretched beyond the limits of my vision in every direction. The air was thick and oppressive, filled with the weight of malevolent presence, and I could hear sounds in the distance that made my soul recoil with primitive terror. Screaming, crying, the wet sounds of violence being inflicted on unwilling victims. Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt the presence of pure evil, because what I encountered in that supernatural realm was beyond anything my human mind was equipped to process or understand. As my eyes adjusted to the otherworldly darkness, I began to see figures moving in the shadows around me, dozens of them, then hundreds, all standing motionless and staring in the same direction, like an audience waiting for some terrible performance to begin. When I looked more closely at these figures, I realized with growing horror that I recognized some of them. There was Linda Kowalski, the nurse whose murder I had tried and failed to prevent. There was Miguel Santos, the cook who had been stabbed behind the diner. There was Sarah Martinez, the woman who had been attacked in the parking garage during my first sleepwalking episode. All of them were present in this impossible space, along with countless other victims of violence that I had witnessed in my supernatural visions over the past 8 months. But they weren't alone. Standing among the victims were other figures that I didn't immediately recognize, but somehow understood to be fellow witnesses like myself. People who had been cursed with the ability to see future crimes. People who had been selected by whatever supernatural force controlled this realm to serve as unwilling observers of violence and suffering. Some looked like they had been standing in this dark space for years, their faces gaunt and hollow with the weight of witnessing countless acts of brutality. Others appeared more recent, their expressions still showing the shock and confusion that I remembered from my early sleepwalking episodes. Hit the like button if this supernatural revelation is making you question everything you thought you knew about reality, because what happened next was when I finally understood the true nature of my curse. A voice spoke in the darkness, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, resonating not through my ears but directly into my consciousness with the weight of cosmic authority. "You have been chosen," the voice said, and the words felt like ice water flowing through my veins. "You have been selected to bear witness to the violence that maintains the balance between order and chaos, between life and death, between the world that is seen and the world that exists in shadow. Every act of brutality you have observed, every murder you have witnessed, every assault you have been shown serves a purpose greater than your human understanding can comprehend." I tried to speak, tried to ask why I'd been chosen for this burden, why I was being forced to see things that no one should have to witness, but my voice seemed to have been stripped away in this supernatural realm. I could only listen as the entity continued to explain the cosmic machinery that I had unknowingly become part of. "Violence is the engine that drives human consciousness forward," the voice continued, its tone completely devoid of emotion or empathy. "Without suffering, without death, without the constant threat of brutality, your species would become complacent and stagnant. The fear of violence drives innovation, cooperation, and progress. The reality of violence reminds humans of their mortality and their vulnerability. The witnessing of violence serves as a warning and a reminder that chaos is always lurking beneath the surface of your ordered existence." As the entity spoke, images began to appear in the darkness around me. Not just the crimes I had personally witnessed, but violence from throughout human history. Wars and genocides, murders and massacres, individual acts of cruelty that had shaped the course of civilization through their ripple effects on survivors and witnesses. I saw how each act of violence had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate victims, how fear and trauma and loss drove people to make different choices, to build different institutions, to create different solutions to the problems of human existence. Subscribe if you want to hear more about the supernatural forces that influence human history, because what I was being shown was a cosmic perspective on violence that treated individual human suffering as nothing more than fuel for some vast engine of progress and evolution. The entity explained that there have always been witnesses like me throughout history, people selected to observe future violence and serve as unwitting participants in ensuring that necessary acts of brutality occurred exactly as they were destined to happen. Your attempts to prevent the violence you witness are part of the mechanism by which that violence is made inevitable, the voice explained with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. Your panic, your warnings, your desperate efforts to save lives, all of these reactions serve to create the exact conditions necessary for the crimes to unfold as they must. You are not a failed hero, unable to prevent tragedy. You are a successful participant in the cosmic order, ensuring that the violence that drives human development continues to occur with precise timing and maximum impact. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, and I felt something fundamental breaking inside my consciousness. Every person I had tried to save, every warning I had attempted to give, every desperate effort I had made to use my supernatural knowledge for good had actually been part of ensuring that innocent people died exactly as I had foreseen. I wasn't a victim of cosmic injustice. I was an active participant in cosmic cruelty, a willing tool in the hands of forces that treated human suffering as a necessary ingredient in some vast supernatural recipe. Comment below whether you think some people are destined to serve purposes beyond their own understanding, because what the entity told me next was even more disturbing than learning that I was complicit in the violence I witnessed. It explained that my sleepwalking visions would continue to escalate, that the crimes I was shown would become more frequent and more brutal, that I would eventually be witnessing multiple murders every night, as the supernatural force that controlled my curse fed my growing trauma and despair back into the cosmic engine that required human suffering to function. Your sanity, your relationships, your capacity for hope and joy, these are also fuel for the greater purpose you serve, the voice continued. As you become more isolated, more desperate, more consumed by the horror of what you witness, your own suffering adds to the sum total of human anguish that drives progress and evolution. You will continue to serve until your mind breaks completely, and then you will join the permanent audience of witnesses who observe violence throughout eternity. I looked around at the other figures standing in the supernatural darkness and realized that many of them had the blank, broken expressions of people whose sanity had been completely shattered by witnessing too much violence for too long. They were no longer fighting against their curse or trying to prevent the crimes they saw. They had become passive observers, worn down by years or decades of supernatural horror, until they were nothing more than empty vessels for witnessing brutality. The entity showed me my own future. Years of sleepwalking to increasingly violent crime scenes, watching murders become more savage and frequent, trying desperately to maintain some sense of purpose and humanity while being systematically broken down by exposure to the worst aspects of human nature. I saw myself becoming increasingly isolated as friends and family grew tired of my claims about supernatural visions, increasingly suspected by law enforcement as my presence at crime scenes became impossible to explain as coincidence, increasingly unstable as the weight of witnessing constant violence took its toll on my mental health. Share your thoughts on cosmic purpose versus individual suffering in the comments below, because the final revelation was the most crushing of all. The entity explained that I had not been randomly selected for this curse. I had been chosen specifically because of my capacity for empathy, my desire to help others, my natural instinct to try to prevent suffering when I encountered it. These qualities, which I had always considered to be among my best characteristics, were exactly what made me useful as a supernatural witness to violence. Compassionate observers suffer more intensely when they witness brutality they cannot prevent, the voice explained. Their anguish feeds the cosmic engine more efficiently than the suffering of those who are naturally callous or indifferent to the pain of others. Your kindness is not a virtue in this context. It is a tool that makes you more effective at generating the emotional energy that powers the mechanisms of human development. When the vision ended, I woke up in my own bed for the first time in months, but I knew that this was not a sign that my curse had lifted. Instead, it was a temporary reprieve, a moment of false hope designed to make my return to supernatural witnessing even more psychologically devastating. The entity had wanted me to understand exactly what was happening to me and why, not out of kindness or respect for my autonomy, but because that understanding would make my future suffering more acute and more useful for its cosmic purposes. Let me know in the comments if you've ever realized that your best qualities were being used against you by forces beyond your control, because that night marked the beginning of the final phase of my supernatural curse. I now understood that I wasn't just a witness to future violence. I was a carefully selected instrument in a cosmic system that required human suffering to function, and my empathy and compassion were the very qualities that made me effective at generating the emotional energy this system fed upon.
Paragraph 4. The visions intensify beyond endurance, 2,000 words. After my encounter with the supernatural entity, my sleepwalking episodes exploded in both frequency and horror, as if the cosmic force had been waiting for me to understand my true purpose before unleashing the full weight of its terrible design. Instead of witnessing one crime every few nights, I began sleepwalking to multiple crime scenes each night, sometimes experiencing 4 or 5 visions in a single sleep cycle.
Each vision was more violent and disturbing than anything I had previously been shown. as if the entity was systematically exposing me to every form of human brutality imaginable. Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt like you were losing your grip on sanity, because the psychological impact of witnessing multiple murders every night was devastating beyond anything I could have prepared for. I would fall asleep exhausted and wake up 8 hours later, feeling like I had lived through years of trauma. My dreams became indistinguishable from my waking thoughts, and my waking thoughts became contaminated by the constant stream of violence I was being forced to observe. I stopped being able to look at people on the street without imagining the horrible ways they might die, stopped being able to enter buildings without visualizing the violence that might unfold within their walls. The crimes I witnessed during this period were not just random acts of violence, but seemed specifically chosen to break down my remaining psychological defenses. I was shown child murders that left me sobbing uncontrollably for hours after waking up. I witnessed torture scenes so prolonged and sadistic that I began to understand why some of the eternal witnesses I had seen in the supernatural realm had blank, broken expressions. I was forced to observe domestic violence that escalated to murder, sexual assaults that ended in death, hate crimes motivated by the darkest aspects of human prejudice and fear. Hit the like button if this escalating horror is becoming too much to bear, because what made these visions even more unbearable was my growing awareness that my emotional reaction to each scene was being harvested by the cosmic entity as fuel for its larger purposes. Every time I wept for a victim, every time I screamed in helpless rage at an attacker, every time I felt my faith in human goodness crack a little more, I was feeding the supernatural system that required this suffering to continue. The most devastating vision came 6 weeks ago, when I was shown a mass shooting that was going to take place at a shopping mall in suburban Denver. Unlike my previous visions, which had focused on individual crimes involving 1 or 2 people, this one showed me the deaths of 17 innocent people, including children, carried out by a gunman whose manifesto I was somehow able to read during my sleepwalking episode. I knew his name, his address, his timeline for the attack, the specific weapons he would use, and the exact locations where each victim would fall. For the first time since my encounter with the supernatural entity, I decided to ignore everything I had learned about the futility of trying to prevent these crimes. 17 people were going to die, including a 6-year-old girl who would be shot while hiding behind a fountain in the mall's food court, and I couldn't just stand by and let it happen, even knowing that my intervention was probably part of the cosmic mechanism that would ensure the shooting occurred exactly as I had seen it. I called the FBI tip line and provided them with every detail I had witnessed in my vision. I gave them the gunman's name and address, described his weapons and his planned route through the mall, explained exactly when and where the shooting would begin. I told them about the manifesto he had posted online, about the warning signs that his coworkers and neighbors had been ignoring, about the specific security vulnerabilities he planned to exploit. Subscribe if you want to hear more about the impossible moral dilemmas created by supernatural foresight, because what happened next was exactly what the cosmic entity had shown me during our encounter in the supernatural realm. The FBI took my tips seriously enough to investigate, and their investigation led to the gunman's arrest 2 days before he planned to carry out the shooting. They found his weapons cache, his manifesto, his detailed plans for the attack. Everything exactly as I had described it in my phone call. For 48 hours, I allowed myself to believe that I had finally managed to prevent one of the crimes I had been shown, that maybe my curse could be turned into something beneficial after all. The news media reported that a potential mass shooting had been prevented by an anonymous tip, that 17 lives had been saved by someone brave enough to call authorities with detailed information about the planned attack. But on the 3rd day after the gunman's arrest, everything went horribly wrong in ways I should have anticipated but had been too desperate to prevent. The shooter's younger brother, radicalized by his siblings' arrest and convinced that their family was being persecuted by government surveillance, decided to carry out his own version of the attack as revenge. He didn't have access to the same weapons or the same detailed planning, but he did have access to a different mall, different victims, and a rage that had been amplified by watching his brother's dreams of violence being thwarted by unknown forces. The second shooting was smaller in scale but more brutal in execution. 8 people died, including the security guard who tried to stop the attack, and 3 teenagers who had been shopping for homecoming dresses. The gunman himself was killed by police, but not before he had inflicted enough carnage to generate the exact amount of trauma and suffering that the cosmic system required. Comment below whether you think preventing one tragedy while causing another is better or worse than allowing the original to unfold, because the aftermath of the mall shooting taught me the most devastating lesson about my curse. The supernatural entity didn't need specific crimes to happen in specific ways. It needed specific amounts of violence, terror, and suffering to be generated within specific time frames. When I prevented the original shooting, I didn't save 17 lives. I simply redirected the cosmic requirement for violence toward different victims who hadn't been shown the mercy of a quick death. The psychological impact of realizing that my intervention had led to the deaths of 8 different people was catastrophic. I had been instrumental in ensuring that those teenagers died, that the security guard left behind a wife and 3 children, that the trauma of witnessing mass violence spread through a different community than originally planned. My attempt to use my supernatural knowledge for good had resulted in different but equally devastating evil. Jake moved out of our apartment after finding me standing in the kitchen at 4 a.m, covered in blood that wasn't there, screaming about children who were dying in a mall that I had never visited. My parents stopped returning my phone calls after I tried to explain to them that I was being used as a tool by cosmic forces that required human suffering to maintain universal balance. My professors placed me on academic leave when my attendance became erratic, and my behavior in class began to disturb other students. The isolation was part of the plan, of course. The supernatural entity had explained that my growing alienation from normal human relationships would increase my psychological vulnerability and make me more useful as a witness to violence. Every friendship I lost, every family member who stopped believing in my sanity, every professional opportunity that disappeared because of my supernatural burden, all of it was feeding the cosmic engine that required my suffering to continue generating emotional energy. Share your experiences with supernatural isolation in the comments below. Because the worst part wasn't the loneliness itself, but the knowledge that my isolation was being deliberately orchestrated by forces that viewed my psychological destruction as a necessary component of their larger design. I wasn't losing my connections to other people because of bad luck or poor choices. I was being systematically separated from sources of support and stability because my despair was more useful to the cosmic system than my happiness would have been. By this point, I was sleepwalking to crime scenes every single night, sometimes experiencing a dozen different visions in a single sleep cycle. I would wake up exhausted and traumatized, knowing that within hours or days, everything I had witnessed would unfold exactly as shown, with my own attempts to prevent the violence serving only to ensure that it happened according to the supernatural timeline. The entity began showing me crimes that were scheduled to occur months or even years in the future, as if building a repository of violence that I would be forced to anticipate and dread for extended periods. I saw murders that wouldn't happen until next Christmas, assaults that were planned for the following summer, domestic violence incidents that would unfold during winter storms that hadn't even formed yet. My entire future became a calendar of horror, with specific dates marked by specific acts of brutality that I would be powerless to prevent. Let me know in the comments if you think it's possible to maintain hope when you know exactly how much suffering lies ahead. Because by this point in my ordeal, I had begun to understand why so many of the eternal witnesses in the supernatural realm had the blank, broken expressions of people whose sanity had been completely destroyed. The human mind is not equipped to process unlimited exposure to violence and trauma, especially when that exposure is coupled with the knowledge that the suffering is purposeful and inevitable. I stopped trying to warn people or prevent crimes, not because I had lost my compassion, but because I had learned that my compassion was being weaponized against both myself and the people I was trying to help. Every act of empathy, every moment of horror at human cruelty, every tear I shed for a victim was contributing to the cosmic system that ensured more victims would be created. The supernatural sleepwalking continued, night after night, vision after vision, crime after crime, in an endless cycle of witnessing and suffering that seemed designed to continue until my mind finally broke completely and I joined the permanent audience of witnesses who observe violence throughout eternity. Paragraph 5. Living with Cosmic Horror. 2,000 words. It's been 3 months since I finally stopped fighting against my supernatural curse, and I'm sharing this story not because I found a way to escape my fate, but because I want other people to understand what's really happening beneath the surface of our everyday reality. The sleepwalking continues every night. The visions of future violence are as frequent and horrible as ever, but I no longer torture myself with futile attempts to prevent crimes that are destined to occur regardless of my actions. I've accepted my role as an unwilling witness to the cosmic machinery that requires human suffering to function, and while that acceptance hasn't brought me peace, it has at least brought me a kind of terrible clarity about the true nature of existence. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to accept something horrible that you couldn't change, because the psychological shift from fighting against my curse to accepting it was perhaps the most difficult transformation I've ever experienced. For months, I had defined myself as someone who was trying to use supernatural knowledge to prevent violence and save lives. My identity was built around the belief that I was fundamentally a good person, trapped in an impossible situation, someone whose compassion and heroic intentions were being thwarted by cosmic forces beyond my control. Learning that my compassion was actually the mechanism being used to ensure that violence continued, that my desperate attempts to help people were part of the supernatural system designed to guarantee their suffering, forced me to completely reconstruct my understanding of who I am and what my existence means. I am not a failed hero. I am a successful component in a vast machine that transforms human empathy into cosmic fuel for processes I will never understand. The hardest part of this realization was accepting that the traits I had always considered to be my best qualities, my desire to help others, my capacity for empathy, my instinctive horror at witnessing suffering, were precisely the characteristics that made me useful to the supernatural entity controlling my curse. I had been selected not despite my compassion, but because of it. Not in spite of my moral instincts, but specifically because those instincts could be weaponized against both myself and the people I encountered. Hit the like button if you've ever discovered that your strengths were actually your greatest weaknesses, because this understanding has fundamentally changed how I navigate my daily existence. I no longer try to form close relationships with other people, not because I've lost my capacity for human connection, but because I understand that my emotional bonds with others would only be exploited by the cosmic system that controls my fate. Every friend I make becomes a potential victim to be shown in my supernatural visions. Every romantic relationship I attempt becomes another source of psychological leverage that can be used to increase my suffering and despair. I've learned to live in a state of careful emotional numbness, maintaining enough humanity to function in ordinary society, but not enough attachment to be devastated when the cosmic entity decides to show me the violent deaths of people I care about. It's a delicate balance between preserving my sanity and avoiding the kind of complete emotional shutdown that would make me less useful as a supernatural witness to violence. The sleepwalking episodes have evolved as well, becoming more sophisticated and psychologically targeted as the entity has learned to calibrate my experiences for maximum emotional impact. Instead of showing me random crimes committed by strangers, I now witness violence involving people whose deaths will affect me personally. Last month, I was shown the future murder of Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who runs the corner store where I buy groceries. 2 weeks ago, I witnessed the planned assault of Dr. Martinez, the therapist who has been trying to help me process the trauma of my supernatural experiences. Subscribe if you want to understand how cosmic horror operates on a personal level, because the entity's strategy has become clear to me over these past months. It's not enough to show me violence and harvest my emotional reaction to that violence. The system requires me to be personally invested in the suffering I witness, to feel genuine loss and grief when the crimes I've foreseen actually occur. The more connected I am to the victims, the more useful my anguish becomes as fuel for whatever larger purposes these supernatural forces serve. I've tried moving to different cities, thinking that perhaps distance from familiar people and places would reduce the personal stakes of the violence I'm shown. But the entity simply adjusts its targeting, showing me crimes involving whatever new community I attempt to join. When I moved to Phoenix, I began witnessing the future murders of my neighbors and co-workers. When I relocated to Portland, the visions focused on violence that would affect the people I met in coffee shops and grocery stores and public transportation. There is no escape through geography, no way to reduce the personal cost of my supernatural experiences by removing myself from social connections. The cosmic system requires me to care about the victims I'm shown, and it will create circumstances to ensure that I develop emotional attachments to whatever community I happen to be living in when the next set of visions begins. The most disturbing development has been my growing awareness that there are others like me scattered throughout the country, perhaps throughout the world. Sometimes in my sleepwalking visions, I catch glimpses of other witnesses standing in the shadows, other people who have been selected to observe future violence and serve as emotional generators for the cosmic machinery that requires human suffering to function. We never interact directly, but I can see the same hollow despair in their eyes that I feel consuming my own consciousness day by day. Comment below if you think there might be supernatural witnesses in your own community, because I've begun to recognize the signs that someone might be experiencing the same curse that has destroyed my life. They're the people who seem to know too much about local crimes before they're reported in the news, the individuals who become increasingly isolated and psychologically unstable without any apparent external cause, the ones who try desperately to warn others about dangers that haven't materialized yet and sound insane in their attempts to prevent violence that seems inevitable. I've also started to understand that my particular form of curse, sleepwalking to crime scenes before they happen, is just one variation in a larger system of supernatural witness roles. Some people are compelled to be present at scenes of violence as they occur, serving as unwilling observers to ensure that the cosmic system receives full documentation of human cruelty. Others are forced to witness past crimes, processing historical violence that feeds the entity's vast archives of suffering. Still others experience prophetic dreams or waking visions, contributing their anguish to the same cosmic engine through different mechanisms of supernatural compulsion. We are all part of the same vast network of emotional harvesting, all selected for our capacity to generate the specific types of psychological energy that power whatever incomprehensible processes require human suffering as fuel. Our individual curses may manifest differently, but we're all serving the same fundamental purpose in a system that treats human empathy and compassion as renewable resources to be systematically exploited. The knowledge that I'm not alone in this experience should be comforting, but instead it fills me with a despair so profound that it threatens to completely overwhelm my remaining psychological defenses. If there are others like me, if this supernatural system is operating on a scale large enough to require multiple witnesses in multiple locations, experiencing multiple types of visions, then the scope of cosmic cruelty is far greater than I had imagined during my worst moments of individual suffering. Share this story with someone who might need to understand what's really happening in the shadows of our world, because I've come to believe that my curse includes not just witnessing future violence, but also serving as a warning to others who might be selected for similar supernatural roles. The entity that controls my experiences wants people to know that systems like this exist, wants potential future witnesses to understand what they might be chosen for, wants the knowledge of cosmic cruelty to spread through human consciousness like a virus of despair. This story itself may be part of the supernatural mechanism designed to increase the sum total of human anxiety about the possibility of being selected for supernatural witness roles. By reading about my experiences, by understanding the true nature of my curse, you may have made yourself more vulnerable to similar selection by demonstrating the kind of empathetic engagement that these cosmic entities find useful. But I'm telling you anyway, because the alternative, carrying this knowledge alone, pretending that the violence I witness every night is meaningless, allowing the cosmic system to operate in complete secrecy, feels like a greater betrayal of human dignity than risking the spread of supernatural contamination through shared awareness. I still live in Denver, still experience sleepwalking visions every night, still wake up with perfect knowledge of violence that will unfold exactly as I've foreseen it. The police have stopped investigating my presence at crime scenes, having concluded that I'm either mentally ill or involved in some elaborate pattern of coincidences they can't explain. My family has accepted that I'm suffering from a psychological condition they don't understand, and they maintain minimal contact with me out of love and obligation rather than genuine hope for my recovery. The crimes continue, night after night, vision after vision, feeding the cosmic engine that requires human suffering to maintain whatever balance or purpose justifies this systematic cruelty. I witness murders and assaults and acts of brutality that would break the minds of people who only had to see them once. But I see dozens of them every week, and my psychological destruction serves as additional fuel for the supernatural forces that control my existence. Let me know in the comments if you think awareness of cosmic horror makes that horror more or less bearable, because I've discovered that understanding the true nature of my curse has not provided me with the peace or resignation I had hoped for. Knowledge of why this is happening to me has not made the suffering any easier to endure, and awareness of the larger cosmic purposes my torment serves has not given my experiences any meaningful context or dignity. I remain trapped in a supernatural system that harvests human empathy as fuel for incomprehensible processes, forced to witness endless violence while knowing that my emotional reactions to that violence are being used to ensure that more violence will be created. There is no escape, no hope for rescue or redemption, no possibility that this cosmic machinery will ever release me from my role as an unwilling witness to tomorrow's horrors. The sleepwalking continues. The visions persist, and somewhere in the vast darkness that exists between sleeping and waking, other witnesses like me are experiencing their own versions of this same cosmic nightmare. We are all feeding the same terrible engine, all contributing our suffering to the same supernatural system, all trapped in roles we never chose and cannot escape. And every night, the violence continues, exactly as we have seen it, exactly as it must be, exactly as the cosmic order requires it to happen in a universe where human compassion is nothing more than fuel for forces that exist beyond our understanding or control.